Hey everybody, welcome to this video. This is part 3 in our series where we are taking the scorecard dashboard and building it from concept to completion. So in the previous video, we really built out the data source that's doing most of the heavy lifting for this dashboard. And we're taking this admittedly opinionated approach of mine that in general, I prefer to build dashboards in a component-based format where things are very flexible and very independent, meaning this component for my daily visual is independent from the weekly and the monthly, so that if we need to go back into any one of these individual components and change something specifically for that piece of the dashboard, we can do so without having to go back to the drawing board and rebuild everything. You know, if this were instead, one single worksheet, we would have some serious problems if our stakeholders came back to us and said, we need to change one thing about that monthly piece. It's a big problem if the monthly piece isn't really a piece. It's just, it's actually a hard written in stone portion of a larger worksheet. So we build things in a component-based format to avoid that kind of problem, and that's really where we landed in the previous video. We have a very componentized data source, and now in today's video, we're going to take this to the next level, where we're going to build out the components that you see here in the top section of the dashboard, which is the time comparison visuals, and also this text. Now, I will just revisit that this text is not necessarily something I would normally do for an executive scorecard dashboard. However, in this case, this particular dashboard was built with printing to PDF in mind. So that's why we have this basically a tooltip that's printed out over here, because if you're receiving a PDF and you're not interacting with the dashboard, you might have a lot of questions looking at this, like, what does this actually mean? And you don't have the luxury of hovering over a visual to get that information, to get that context explained to you in a tooltip. So enough of me just rambling about this. Let's move in to actually building this out. So we are now in our development workbook where we're building this stuff up, and this is where we left off last time. So we got our data source to the point where we could drag over some of these raw ingredients, such as, in this case, what is my current month's value? What was my previous month's value? Same thing for weeks and days and quarters and years. And we got this situation where you can see each of these individual values in a worksheet. So let's take this from just a dump of information into the visual components that you see here. So for starters, before we dive into building that, I do want to point out that where we left off last time, our percentages were left in a decimal format. So one thing that we're going to want to make sure we do is revisit the data pane over here under the folder measures/var%/periods. And all of these values should look something like this right now in decimal format. And this would normally be fine if you were going to use Tableau's default percentage format. You could come into, all right, we're looking at month right now. So you could come in here and you could say default property number format. And you'll notice here I have a custom format. I'm just going to copy this really quickly. But if you use percentages, you'll notice that, okay, 845% increase. It doesn't seem to add up here. So if I come in and I get rid of this multiplying by 100 for my month, we'll see that the Tableau approach to formatting a percentage, it already takes into account this what is required to convert a decimal representation of a number into a percentage. So when you use this formatting, the one that's built into Tableau to show a number as a percentage, it multiplies that number for you. But since we're going to use a custom format where we have these little triangles that pop up, that it's going to give us an upwards triangle if the value is a positive percent change, or a downwards triangle if it's a negative percent change. Because we're doing this, we are not using Tableau's default percentage formatting. And so if I plug this in, you'll notice, that changed from an 8% change. Now it's a 0.08. Well, that ends up being the correct number if we come in here and we make sure that this number is represented as a percentage, which really just means we need to take that result that we had before, wrap that in parentheses, and multiply it by 100. Now we get the 8.45% that we expect to see. So let's make sure that I unmess up my daily value here, which I need to multiply by 100 as well. And we can see for quarter and week and year, we should already have this multiplied by 100. Just wanted to point that out so there's no confusion. Now, I really like doing this, just a little side note, having these arrow indicators going up or down for these percentages. I find it particularly useful when you're visualizing things in a dashboard, because this allows us to inline in the tooltip and inline in this text that we're putting in the bar, have that visual indication of up or down, which really complements nicely this the color we're getting as well. You'll notice here that all of these blue bars, the current value is higher than the previous value. That's why that bar is colored blue. And then in this case, the daily value is a little bit below what yesterday's value was. So we end up with the orange bar, and you get that downwards arrow for that negative percent change. So how do we make this happen? Let's get into this. So if we go into a new worksheet, for this sheet, the very first thing we want to do is we want to build the foundational layers to making a bar like this happen. If we dissect this, we could see that there is a bar. There is also a reference line. So the bar is giving us the current period's value. In this case, when we're looking at the daily information, this is the current day's value. And then the reference line is coming from the previous day's value. And the text is giving us what the current day's value was. And then we also get this piece of text that's telling us what the percent change is for our current value compared to the previous. So we can start out by just dragging our current day up here into columns. So columns is the thing that's going to build you an x-axis. We don't want this in rows. Nope, that's going to give us a vertical bar. Instead, we want this on columns. All right, so it's a good start. Now the easiest next step is let's get that reference line that's going to give us the that previous day's value so that we can have that comparison. You know, were we above, were we below? I don't really know yet. So let's click onto our folder for our previous periods. Let's take the previous day and let's add this as a reference line. Now you'll notice if I right click on this axis right now out here in our visual and I go to add reference line, there is no option here for any other value other than what is currently in the context of my worksheet. So that's something good to know, is that, okay, in order to get something as a reference line, we need to drag it into our visual. And just some marks card 101 over here for you. You'll notice right now I have these little, this dot pattern over here next to this field. Now, if I were to drop this onto color, you'd notice that I get this, this icon changes to match color. So when something is sitting on detail, it is playing just a role of its contextual information that you can use in your worksheet, but it's not really doing anything on its own. So what we could do though, now that this field has been brought into the detail of our worksheet, we can right click on this axis, we can add a reference line, and now we will see, aha, I can add my previous day's value. So this looks kind of hideous right now. It's got this label that I don't really want in my picture. I have this really light gray reference line. So let's modify this a bit. There are a few things we can control here. First of all, for the label, let's set this to none, so we get no label. Then for the tooltip, I'm actually going to make this custom, and I'm going to say, if I happen to hover over that reference line, I just want it to say previous, and then a colon, and then the number of what my previous day's value was. I'm also going to make this line a little bit darker, And if you wanted to, you could make this different levels of thickness. I like this thickness, so that's what I'm going to stick with. And if I click OK, now we can see I have my my bar. If I hover over it, I can see what my current value was. I can see what my previous value was. And if I hover over just the previous reference line, we would end up seeing previous and then what that previous value was. Now there's some cleanup I want to do here. I don't know if you can see it that well, but I am getting tick marks in here, and I've got this little almost invisible gray line over here, which I don't really want. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to format my sheet. I am going to come over here to the format lines options, and while having sheets selected, so here if I click rows or columns, you can see that on the left you have sheet. This is going to format all of the lines for my sheet. And I really don't want any zero lines. I don't want any trend lines. I do want reference lines. Keep in mind, this is a reference line, so I do want that to be showing up in my sheet. So every other type of line, though, I'm going to set to none. Now I'm still getting this. Somehow this little rogue line is still here. So sometimes what you have to do is you have to do this search and destroy mission where you go through rows and then columns. And for some reason, columns here, we have this rogue agent under grid lines. So let's just set that to none. And now that little almost invisible line has gone away. All right. So while we're talking about reference lines, I do want to bring into the mix here something special that I've done for these visuals. For this, we're going to have to really quickly hop back out into this. And you'll notice that if you were to build out all of these components and you didn't do this next step I'm about to show you, all of these lines would fill out to the maximum width possible, which is really undesirable because this number here, you can see like this yearly value, the average closing price is pretty low compared to all these other values. And if you look really closely, you'll see that like even my quarterly value, this 58,571, that's slightly lower than 59,652. And this bar is a little bit longer. It comes out a little bit further to the right than does this one. And it comes out a lot further to the right than this one. Now, what's scaling these bars is this invisible reference line that I have inserted into each one of these components. And rather than having to go back and add this later, I want to do this up front because we're going to see after I build up one of these components to the way that we like it, we're going to very quickly be able to build the other components because we're going to duplicate this sheet and we're just going to change the fields that the sheet is referencing. So in order to reduce the amount of work we have to do later, let's go ahead and visit this scaling concept. So just like we added a reference line for our previous day, we are going to add a reference line for this scaling average closing price combined. Now what this thing is doing, before we look inside that formula, let's first look inside like the scaling, one of these ingredients that feeds into the combined formula would be figuring out which value is higher, my current day or my previous day. So we get the max of this. So only one of these two are going to battle to the death, and whichever one is higher, it's going to be returned by this field. Now, if we look at month, it's the same story. We compare the current month's value to the previous month's value. They battle to the death, and then whichever one comes out on top is the value that's going to be represented by this field. Now, that's the same story for all these other time periods, and by the time we get into this combined field, this is simply doing a bunch of nested maximum formulas, and I wish there was a better way to do this, but in Tableau we do have to nest these because there's no way to just pass a list of values and get the highest of all of them. Instead, we just have to kind of have a series of competitions. So here, like this maximum value is going to say, well, which one comes out on top? This formula, the value that gets outputted by this formula, or the value that gets outputted by this one. And then, whatever is evaluated here in this maximum calculation is going to be whichever of these two is highest. Then the same story down here, whichever of these two is highest is going to be evaluated. And then we have wrapped around that another maximum statement. So we basically just have this this almost like a bracket in a sports competition, you know, where you start out with 16 teams playing, and whoever wins goes to the next round. We have the same thing going on here with these values, so that when we look at these components out here, we can end up having one value. I don't know if this is going to date me, but there was that movie or that show Highlander back in the day. You know, there could only be one, and all of them are fighting to the death, and you just have one champion coming out at the top. It's the same thing for these values. We have one value that's going to be the highest of all of our previous and current time periods, and that's going to be the one value that scales all the rest of these bars. Now, if you have questions about that, if it's not super clear, feel free to throw a comment into on this video, and I'll try to explain it in even more depth to you, or make another video that goes into this in even more depth. But the bottom line here is that we have a bunch of values. We want to know which one's the highest, and this ends up spitting out the highest value of all things considered. And then we can drag this into our worksheet. And just like we made a reference line for our previous day's value, or our previous period's value in this sheet, we can add a reference line that's going to say, I want to make sure that this bar is scaled such that it's never going to exceed, like it's always going to be limited by what this highest value was. So that's why I call it a scaling value. And we can see this is actually going to end up scaling this bar a bit. So the highest value known to this dashboard out here, it's going to be something that we're going to make invisible, and it's going to impact the way this visual looks, but it's not really something we want our user to focus on. This is really kind of the man behind the curtains, doing something that's impacting our visual, but not in a way that's immediately obvious and distracting to the person interacting with the dashboard. So we're going to make this as invisible as possible by getting rid of the label. We are going to have no tooltip for this thing. We are going to make the line invisible. I'm also, I guess I don't even have to change the thickness here because we've set the line to be none. And if we click OK, now you can see that if I were to look at this visual out here, we don't even see this reference line, but if I happen to hover over it, we end up seeing it existing out here. And the reason it's scaling this bar is if I didn't have this here, my bar here would be filling up this empty space. But we don't want it to, because that's going to give us this effect out here, like where this bar does not extend all the way to the right, because it's being scaled by what this highest value that we see is. So even though this data does not all belong in the same worksheet, we are able to scale it as if all of these components exist in the same worksheet due to some clever formula magic that we just did. All right, if you're still with me there, now that we have that reference line in place, let's keep building this out. So one more time, let's take a look over here. We can see that there's some text we want to add onto our bar, and we want to color the bar such that it's blue if our current value is higher than the previous value, or it's orange if the current value is lower than the previous value. So let's first add text. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, I want to take my my current value. In this case, I'm looking at daily data, so let's take average closing price current day and drop that onto text. So it's not exactly where we want it to be right now, so let's do something about that. We can click in here onto label. You know, when I drop this onto label, we can see over here that this pill is associated with the text. So if we look over here to the corresponding marks card button, and we click on this, we're going to be able to edit properties of that text. So the first thing I want to do is I want to align this to the left. Immediately we can see that my text is now showing up on the left side of the bar, just like we have out here. Now what I want to do is I also want to bring in the percent change. So if we go in here to var percent for our periods, and we take the appropriate period, which is the day, we could drag this onto text as well. And everything disappears because right now if we click into text, it's trying to fit too much stuff. Like this is a very, very skinny bar and we're trying to show 2 lines of text, which doesn't fit. But if we move it all into the same bar and click apply, now we'll see that we get both those pieces of information side by side. However, I actually want this bit of information to be on the right-hand side. So let's do that. Click apply again. And now we can see I get my current day's value. I get the percent change. And I can also make this maybe 10-point font and bold. And if I click apply, we can see, all right, this is a little bit easier to read, but it's not perfect yet. This blue that the bar is colored, that blue is a little too dark for me to really be able to see my text well. So let's do this next step of adding the color dimension to this visual. So again, we want it to be some kind of light blue if it's a positive percent change, and we want it to be a light orange if it's a negative change. So let's take our percent change, and you can either drag this out from your data pane, or if you already have this field existing in your marks card, we can take this percent change, and I'm going to hold the command button. Be careful that you do hold the command button. This is for Mac, or the control button if you're on a Windows machine while you click and drag this. That's going to duplicate it. If you didn't do that, if I just clicked and dragged, I would be reassigning this. So now we lose the text because I've reassigned the role of this to be giving me color instead of text. So just a little aside there of how you can easily copy a field in your marks card and have it play 2 roles at the same time. I just command click and drag that to color. Okay, so now this looks good. Instead of getting a blue color, we're getting orange because this is negative. But I do need to do something about this color. I want to make sure that if tomorrow this value swings positive, that I would actually have the correct color appearing. Now the way I can do this is I can double click into this color legend, and instead of just having one definition of color, I can make sure that I assign this to a color gradient. In this case, orange to blue diverging makes sense, or let's see. Yeah, let's just go with that. Orange to blue diverging. This is reversed right now, so let's not reverse that. So I want orange to be my negative side. I want blue to be my positive side. And I can go into advanced, and I want to make sure that I have a start and an end and a center. And maybe my start could be negative 0.5, and my end could be 0.5. And if I click apply, we're already going to see some 2 different colors come in, but my center is not what I want it to be. Let's make the center 0. So now I have this nice color gradient here, but I don't really want a color gradient so much as I want stepped colors. In this case, I don't care by how little my percent change is negative, or how little it's positive, or how big that positive or that negative change is. If it's negative at all, I always want it to be the same orange or the same blue. Now this is going to help me prevent situations like this, where if I had a big negative percent change, it's kind of hard to read this text because that orange gets darker. So rather than messing with that and potentially having a bad UI or a bad user experience if they can't really read that text, let's just make sure that this orange is always easily readable. And I'm not going to be too picky about this here. I would normally put more thought into what color I'm going to make this. But let's just make this some kind of lighter orange, and let's just maybe navigate a little bit, find something that's suitable. So if I click OK, all right, that orange that's acceptable for me for this purpose. By the way, you could also, let's say you go out to Google. Right now I'm on a single screen because I'm recording, but normally I'd have a dual monitor set up, and if I wanted to, I could click this little drop icon, and I could hover over any color on my screen and I could select that color. I use that all the time. I highly recommend it. But in this case, I just kind of have to shoot in the dark because I'm in recording mode. So let's do the same for blue. Let's find a nice suitable light blue color for our positives. Click OK. And yeah, this isn't perfect, but it's acceptable. Okay. So now we have this this much more legible text on our orange background, and we'll see that this black text will also be quite legible on top of that blue text. By the way, I recommend going orange and blue instead of red and green. Christmas colors is a big favorite in the enterprise world, unfortunately, but you have colorblind people who cannot really tell the difference between green and reds, typically, and then it's also kind of an eyesore. So I do recommend if you go with orange and blue, it's much more colorblind friendly, and that is like something like 10% of the population. So do them a favor and err on the side of orange and blue color schemes, I would say, rather than red and green. Christmas colors are a bit cheesy anyways for dashboards and overused. All right, so now we have this figured out. Let's wrap up one last thing on this dashboard, which is our tooltips. So right now the tooltip here is kind of not great. If we hover out over here to this final product, we can see that the tooltip is written in more of an explanatory kind of way, instead of just giving the raw fields that are pipe delimited and kind of if you're living in a broom closet with a server rack next to you, you might like these database kind of I just want the field name, but your business user probably is going to appreciate having more legible tooltips. So let's edit this, and let's say this is going to be today's average close price for our current period. Then we have yesterday's average close price, and then for our percent change. You know what? Let's add one more thing in here as well. Let's add in the actual difference. So we're going to make this even better than that finished product that we have, because we're going to add in some context. Let's just drop this into detail, and let's make sure that down here we insert our not the percentage, but the actual difference, which is stored under average close price var and then day, var being variance, once again, not the statistical variance, but just how much did they vary from time period to time period. So this could be change let's see, what would we want to call this? Change period over period. That seems reasonable enough to me, and let's make this kind of consistent with those other colors that we're seeing. Well, that's not consistent. Which color is this? Well, we don't have to get this gray exactly right. We could get close enough. That looks close enough. Okay, so anyways, after that little side conversation there, now we get the actual amount that was different between our current period and our previous period. And for the percentage, we could say percent change period over period. And then the scaling value is not really something our user needs to be concerned with, so let's just remove that from the tooltip altogether. Click OK, and now if we hover over this, it's nice, nicer than we had before. It gives us the current value, the previous value, what the difference is between those two, and then what that percent change is. And you'll notice in that tooltip, we also get that nicely formatted percent change that has the up or down arrow. So I like how this has come together, and we can now uncheck show header and maybe give this sheet a name. So we could call this, you know what, actually I was supposed to build this over here, so let's delete this, move this sheet over in its place, and give this the name average closing price day bar. Whoops, looks like I got these backwards. If I follow my typical naming conventions, average closing price bar, and then our daily value. The reason I name this, I just want to know what metric I'm actually showing, like what KPI I'm focusing on, then what type of visual it is, and then what time period am I focusing on. We'll see that I'll also do this for the text, which we'll build up next. and I'm going to follow the same naming convention, but it's going to be average closing price, so the KPI we care about, then what type of visual format it is, and then the time period. Now, I did promise you this glorious future of being able to duplicate this sheet. Once we got it in the format we wanted, we want to be able to duplicate it and then just easily make this same thing, but for our weekly time period, and then for our monthly and for our quarterly. So how do we go about doing that? Well, it's very simple. We come down here, we right click on this sheet where we built our daily component. We duplicate this. Let's go ahead and name this week at the end instead of day. And now this simply becomes an exercise of changing all of the day values in these fields to week. So this is, you could do this a couple different ways. You could drag the week fields in here on top of these, but I find sometimes that messes with the formatting. If we want to keep the formatting the same, like even our color formatting here, keep that all the same and everything's exactly the same as it was for our daily component, but now it's just showing weekly data. All we need to do is come in here and see that we're in our weekly sheet. Well, now I can replace day with week, and I can come down here to this field where we see day, and I can change this to week, and I can change this to week. And by the way, I'm just double clicking on these fields, on these pills, and then I'm changing these to week, and I'm clicking outside of it, and that's pointing just to a different field. Everything, the structure of the worksheet stays the exact same, and down here I can change this to week as well. Now I'm actually going to just rearrange the location of this field just because I like to keep things organized, if you could tell, out here by my data pane, and I figure since this is the only field down here that we're not changing from day to week, might as well just keep all of our weekly stuff here in a nice row. And if we look up here now, we can see that here's my daily component. And while it took us however long it's taken up to this point to build the daily bar, in order to build that weekly bar, all we needed to do is duplicate the sheet, and then in 15 seconds or so, we have our weekly component. So I absolutely understand the, just to play devil's advocate here, that we have done a lot of extra work up front in terms of building a componentized dashboard like you see here. There is a cost that goes into making this thing very flexible and having all of these pieces of the dashboard be independent. Not everybody's going to like this. I like it because it gives us more control over the dashboard, gives us something that we can come in and with a scalpel we can change and fine tune very specific pieces of the dashboard. But yes, you do have to put some extra effort up front into building the data source in a way that facilitates building those individual components. But now that we have those components, it's not like we have to build each one of those from scratch. We can take one component, duplicate it, change some very minor aspects of it, like these fields that it's referencing, and then we have an entirely new component that's just populating with the relevant data. So we could do this again for month, in quarter, in year. I'll leave that as an exercise to you. Once again, you would just duplicate this value, double click on the sheet name, change this, instead of week, we'd be referencing month. And then you could go through and you could change all the references to the weekly data to instead reference monthly data. The reason you don't have to change the scaling combined price is because that formula was always going to show whatever the highest value was between all of our current and all of our previous periods, so that we scale all of our bars accordingly. So you never have to change this one, but you do have to change all the other fields. Change the values that they reference. So now we'll leave that as an exercise for you to duplicate those sheets and build out those components. Now we can focus in on the final piece here, which is the text. So, actually one thing that we will want to do as well is for these components. I should have done this earlier. Slap myself a little bit here for not doing this, but we do want to filter this to be a specific currency. So we do want to take our symbol in here, and I think I actually added this in after the last video, so I do want to point out really quickly, you know how I have this almost religious belief not to use raw fields directly? Like we could drag symbol over here and filter this to just look at one of our currencies, like Bitcoin. But instead of doing that, I want to first build a field that points to our raw data, that raw symbol field, and put that into symbol base, much like we did for our dates, right? Like we brought in our time field, but we don't use that directly. Instead, we point to time with time base, and that's to protect ourselves from data changing in the back end or from field names changing on us. This is just a tried and true method that has come through for me many times. Very useful. But now, if I want to keep things consistent with how I might see them in the Gemini Exchange, right? Everything might be in uppercase format instead of a lowercase Bitcoin, BTC, USD, or whatever. I might just want to convert this all to uppercase. So I've done this here. This isn't really essential, but it's something I did and I wanted to show you. I did create this field, symbol, aliased uppercase. And in this case, an alias is really just a nickname or a renaming of a field. And so if we drag this over here to filters, we can see now everything is in uppercase format, and I'm just going to select BTC USD. I'll go ahead and do that for my weekly data over here as well. And I really should have done this before I started duplicating my components. But yeah, anyways, you don't necessarily need to do this. We'll see at the very end. We can add a filter in, and then once we're in a dashboard, we can make a filter apply to all other worksheets in the dashboard. But in any case, wanted to show you this so that your data source, if you really are trying to keep up with exactly how my data source looks, you will want to add this folder over here, dimensions original base, where you create the symbol base field, and that just simply points to symbol. And then symbol aliased uppercase, which just uses the upper formula to get the uppercase version of those symbols. All right, now let's top this off by building the text that we see. So over here we get this basically a really like a paragraph explaining us what the cryptocurrency we've currently selected is, what the value was at the start of the current period, what the value was at the start of the previous period. Or sorry, that's a bad way of phrasing it. This is the average price throughout the period that started on this date. So for our weekly data, we would see the average price of Bitcoin the week of April 5th was some value, and then the average price the week of March 29th. So that's the week before April 5th, and that was some other value. And then we get what the difference is between those, as well as what the percent difference is. All right, so let's make this come to life. For starters, let's filter our worksheet to only show one cryptocurrency. So I'm going to make sure that this is only showing Bitcoin USD. And now I'm just going to bring in all the fields that are going to help me build up that text. In no particular order. So let's scroll through this. We know we already have the symbol as a filter, but let's also bring that in here to text. Now let's also bring in our date information. So these time periods. So we need to know what the current period was. And so let's start with our daily information. So bring in the day, bring in the previous day. Let's make sure that both of these are exact dates. And this format, I'm not really a fan of this format for written text. If we look out here, I have this really nice, this gorgeous April 11th, 2021. How do we get this? How do we get this format? So let's take a look at that. Let's format one of these dates. And if we click in on dates, we go down to custom. You'll notice here as I start to type in M for month, If I just put in 1M, we get 4. Okay, that makes sense because it's April. If I put in 2, we get 04. That still makes sense because it's April. Then for 3 M's, we get an abbreviated 3-letter version of April. But if you put in 4 M's, you get the entire month spelled out. So that's what I want. Now I'm going to put in a comma and a space, and then I'm going to want the day of the month. So I put in 2 D's, space, and then 4-digit year. All right. Let's just copy this. Let's make sure we format our other date as well and paste in that formatting. All right, so we have our current day, we have our previous day. We're not worrying about the sentence structure yet. We're just getting all the raw ingredients we need to bake this pie into our marks card. So we can collapse these dates. We don't need them anymore. We come down here to our current value. Let's make sure we bring that in. Previous value. Let's bring that in as well. Now we need to know what the difference was between our previous and our current. So let's bring in that information. Notice I'm dropping them all on text. We need that because otherwise it's just going to be in detail without actually showing up. Just to prove my point, if we drag this guy in here and we don't put it on text, great, I have my percentage in here and we are not seeing it. So let's make sure we drop this onto text. And now let's make this come to life in a sentence-like structure. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of this. I'm going to move it over to be left justified so it's easy to see. And I'm actually going to write this out like a sentence. So let's just say the average closing price on whatever day. So I could copy and paste this, but you know what? I'm just going to go to insert and I'm going to say, give me my current day in the wrong place. Let's make sure that my cursor is on where I want this to land. So the average closing price, and we actually want to know for what, for the symbol that we're concerned with. So Bitcoin USD, the average closing price for that symbol on whatever day was whatever that value is for the current day. Beautiful. Now we can say the average closing price on whatever the previous period was. So let's find that. Time previous day was, and let's say what that previous value was. Now we can finally close this off with the difference is, and we can say that's what this var field is, and then in parentheses what the percentage, the corresponding percentage is. So that's var percent day. All right. Now I'm just going to delete all of these guys. Don't need those anymore. And we can click apply, click OK. And super ugly, but let's go ahead and click entire view up here in this little box. So now we can just see all that text. All right, now one thing I don't like about this, let's compare this to what's out here. Out here, if you can tell, it's a little bit subtle, but all those values that are data points are bold. And this is a little trick I like to use in Tooltips and in text on dashboards, just to make the actual data, like the things that people should focus on, pop out. And then all the extra filler text is there as extra information, but someone's going to very quickly kind of notice these things that stand out and that are in bold. So let's make sure we go into text and we make this bold for all of the data that we have in here. So I can just highlight all of these things, and I'm on a Mac, so I hit Command B, or you could hit Control B on a Windows machine to bold that text. And now this would be extremely tedious for us to go through and do this for every time period. But once again, we have this nice situation where we can just duplicate this sheet. We have this component. Let's duplicate it. Let's name this week. And now we can go through and we can say, I don't care about my current day. I care about my current week. or my current WEC. There we go. Let's spell that right. I don't care about my previous day. I care about my previous week. And again, anytime I see day, I'm going to change that to week. Let's make this a week. And I want to know that difference at the weekly level, and I want to know that percent change at the weekly level. All right, now we can see I'm seeing all this at the weekly level instead of the daily level. And we could duplicate this again and just go through and quickly make the change for my months, my quarters, and my years. However, I am going to make a very slight modification to the text. Since now we're looking at weekly data, I'm going to say the average closing price for, let's say for the week of, and then whatever, oops, put that in the wrong place. The average closing price, let's cancel. Let's go back in here, let's edit this. I actually want to put that text in front of my week. So the average closing price for Bitcoin, the week of whatever that week is, and the average closing price the week of my previous week. Let's see how this looks. All right, the closing price for Bitcoin the week of April 12th was, and I got a little extra space in there. So let's just get rid of that extra space because I care about those kinds of things. And now that looks good to me. Okay, so now as we duplicate this component, we go through, we can very quickly make this component for our monthly, our quarterly, and our yearly data. And all we really need to change is this very slight phrasing in the text area. All right. So if we duplicate all those components and replace the values here according to the time period we actually care about, then we will have all of the building blocks for us to go through and start to build this dashboard. So by now, at the end of this video, we have what we need to build all of these components. We have everything we need to build these components. And what's remaining is we still need to build this nice little legend here. This is not a kind of default out of the box legend. We have a kind of custom symbol in here, these nice little ovals. It also gives us this kind of tooltip effect as we hover over it, which you don't typically get from a legend. And then next week, we're going to focus on this. We are going to build out this trend line and add in these parameter controls where we can see change the number of days in the moving average, and this title changes for us, reflecting the actual days in the moving average, and the same goes for the trend line itself. So we will cover all of that in the next video, and I hope this video has been valuable to you. We really went through building out these components, taking it from where we left off previously with our data source and taking that to the next step where we built out this top half of the dashboard, or at least the ingredients that we need to start to build this. And then in the next couple of videos, we'll really finish off building this bottom section of the dashboard and then make the dashboard come to life. Put all the components in the places that they need to be, show you tricks around how to use layout containers in the best possible way to make your life easy in terms of getting the structure of the dashboard correct. And then we'll have our cryptocurrency scorecard built out. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.